There have been reports that emergency crews in, I think, reactor number 4 have been exposed to 400 millisieverts an hour. How serious is that?
Well, 400 millisieverts is a serious dose from an occupational point of view. The normal yearly rate that's allowed is 20 millisieverts for routine operations, and going up to 50 millisieverts in any 1 year if that's necessary for some reason. In emergency situations, the International Commission on Radiological Protection recommends that planning should occur within a range of 20 to 100 millisieverts, but that people shouldn't receive 100 millisieverts in one event unless it's totally unavoidable to save life or to save massive destruction of equipment.
How serious would those extremely high levels of radiation be for workers operating on the site?
Well, it looks as if it only lasted for a very short time. Certainly the one that was reported, which was 400 millisieverts an hour, which is a very high dose, seemed to be only for a short time. But they certainly have had to evacuate workers at various times because of the radiation levels.
The concern being expressed was that a core group of workers still on site, working in shifts of 50, could develop acute radiation sickness. If these crews are working there for hours on end, how bad could that be?
Well, I believe the 400 millisieverts lasted for a short period of time as there was a release from reactor 4, but so that it didn't continue at that level for a long period of time. But if you worked for several hours at that level, then you would get to big doses of 1 sievert or above, which would start to cause acute radiation syndrome, and you'd have nausea, vomiting, and these sort of effects, and leading to reddening of the skin, hair falling out, and also compromising your immune system.
The terrible situation in the devastated area, it deeply saddens my heart.
As the horror toll of lives lost in the tsunami continued to rise, there was growing alarm within and outside Japan over the fate of Fukushima's nuclear reactors.
I am deeply anxious that the situation at the nuclear plant is critical, and I wish all concerned in their endeavour to solve the problem every success.
We're unfortunately kind of maybe only at the middle of this terrible catastrophe and nowhere near the end. We still have a situation where those 3 reactors are continuing to heat, the fuel is continuing potentially to melt, and it's not at all clear that they've got any kind of real control over the cooling.
Damon Moglen is director of Friends of the Earth's Climate and Energy Project. For more than a decade, he ran Greenpeace International's plutonium campaign and spent a year in Japan focusing on nuclear issues. Last week, in common with other anti-nuclear activists, he expressed great alarm at the challenges facing workers at the plant.
That 3rd reactor, where we had an explosion, is the first reactor of its type at that area in Japan to have plutonium fuel loaded into it. And that raises a huge additional specter of both troubles for controlling the reactor, but also for radioactive releases, because the plutonium is highly radiotoxic. A speck of plutonium inhaled into the human lung is very likely to cause fatal lung cancer 18, 20 years down the line. And it's a radioactive pollutant in our environment for tens of thousands of years. So the problem there is, if that plutonium fuel is melting inside the core, if it's being vented out, or if an explosion were to break the containment open, we could have, and we have as much as 1/4 ton of additional plutonium in that reactor. We could have radioactive releases containing plutonium, which would be just yet another horror to have to deal with.
Richard Bronowski is a former diplomat who was posted to Tokyo in the 1960s and has written a book on Australia's nuclear industry. He too is alarmed by the challenges faced at Fukushima.
I'm particularly worried about unit number 4, where you've got we've got a massive number more of the spent fuel rods in the so-called swimming pool, keeping them cool, than are in the reactor. Now, what's happened is the water has lowered in that, exposing those rods. They've built up their heat and they seem to be damaged too. And the next stage would be a meltdown.
In Unit 4 last week, water covering hundreds of nuclear fuel assemblies was falling dangerously low. Spent fuel is highly radioactive. In order to keep it stable, it's submerged in cooling ponds.
That's one of the classic images of the nuclear industry. One is the reactor dome and the other is that cobalt blue swimming pool with the eerie light. Those spent fuel rods are high-level radioactive waste.
The problem area now is the spent fuel ponds, and particularly Unit 4. Unit 4 was shut down in November, so at the time of the accident it was in a shutdown state. But because it was shut down for maintenance, one of the actions they'd done was to remove all the fuel out of the core and put it into the spent fuel pond, which is in the secondary containment at a high level in the building. So there was a full core, that's 548 fuel assemblies were in that spent fuel core. And because the reactor was operating up to November, there's still got significant decay heat.
How much spent fuel are we talking about here?
The full core load for Unit 4 would be about 98 tonnes of uranium. So it's a substantial quantity.
That sounds quite alarming.
Well, it obviously is an absolute priority to keep that cool.
We believe at this point that Unit 4 may have lost a significant inventory, if not lost all of its water.
And that Unit 3 is in danger?
Well, I would say what we know at Unit 3 is that there's possibly, again, and our information is limited, so what we believe is that there is a crack in the spent fuel pool for Unit 3 as well, which could lead to a loss of water in that pool.
As the crisis escalated, the head of the United States Nuclear Regulatory Commission delivered a pessimistic report to Congress. The same day, military helicopters were brought in to start spraying the plant with water. By now, more than 200,000 people had been evacuated from a 20-kilometre zone around Fukushima. But some remained stranded inside the exclusion zone.
We weren't told when the first reactor exploded. We only heard about it on TV. The government doesn't tell us anything. We're isolated. They're leaving us to die.
It's not just the government which has faced fierce criticism. The disaster at Fukushima has hit the Tokyo Electric Power Company hard. This commercial boasts that 40% of Tokyo's electricity comes from the Fukushima and Niigata power stations. But the company has had a checkered history.
One of the major crises was occurred between 2002 and 2003 when it was discovered that for a number of years, about 16 years or so, the company which is currently in the limelight, namely the Tokyo Electric Power Company, concealed inspection data, and they falsified air pressure readings in the containment buildings. Obviously, when you think about it from the current perspective, these are serious issues because cracks in reactor shrouds indicate that radioactivity could potentially escape if there's enough radioactive buildup.
TEPCO's safety measures now have a hollow ring. No radioactivity can leak to the outside, the company says of its plants. All designs provide margins of safety capable of withstanding even natural disasters. At Fukushima, the 40-year-old plant did not survive the tsunami, which flooded and wrecked the backup generators. Is that a major design failing at that plant?
Well, this is where the modern plants, such as the AP1000, that's the Westinghouse plant that's being built in China, has got a completely passive cooling systems, all contained within the containment, totally independent of any outside supplies. So the modern design of reactor would have coped with this sort of emergency, even this extreme emergency.
The Fukushima disaster has intensified the debate between those who argue that new technology will make the nuclear industry safe and those who point to a long history of nuclear accidents at Windscale in the UK, 3 Mile Island in the US and Chernobyl in the Ukraine as evidence that the industry is unsafe.
When something goes wrong, we're told, well, that reactor's problem was it was a Soviet reactor. That reactor's problem was it was an old reactor. That reactor's problem was that it was next to a river, not the sea. Every reactor, when they go wrong, has a reason to explain it. But the overarching message from industry is it's all fine, it's all good. Now, you can't have it both ways.
I feel an immense sadness and I feel anger that this industry has been allowed to develop as far as it has without as many checks and balances as it should have. One can understand the Japanese desire for autonomy in everything, including power. But I think there's a mafia, just as there is in France, just as there is in South Korea, just as there was in Russia, to some extent in Britain, of secrecy held together by a nuclear priesthood. And the priesthood says, look, trust us, we know.
That secrecy is now being challenged. In Tokyo last week, a rare nuclear industry whistleblower stood up in public to declare his concerns. Dr. Masashi Goto designed containment vessels for nuclear reactors before resigning over safety concerns. In an interview with Four Corners, Dr. Goto criticised his country's record on nuclear safety.
We have the government commission overseeing nuclear safety standards, and in my opinion, they are not doing their job.
Dr. Goto says the Fukushima disaster shows Japan has not yet learned the lessons of history.
At 3 Mile Island, the nuclear fuel melted. Fuel is melting here now. We have to design reactors to withstand melting fuel rods. Right now, the reactor will break down due to the heat generated by the melting rods.
And he claims that profits take precedence over safety.
No one says it officially or openly. When setting standards for future earthquakes, the thought is of money. How much is it going to cost? This underlies the government's decision-making. They're thinking the costs could have bad repercussions for the economy. That's what I think.
Few deny that the Fukushima disaster will hit the industry hard. And in Australia, that will be felt by the miners and exporters of uranium. Australia's mines contain 40% of the world's uranium reserves and produce around 20% of the world's supply, amassing close to $1 billion in export earnings.
Japan takes about a fifth or a sixth of our uranium, and we supply about 20 or 22% of theirs.
Was Australia's uranium being used at Fukushima?
Look, I think the Australia's uranium companies export to Japan, and it's they have commercial in confidence contracts with the companies in Japan, so they don't reveal the utilities to whom they export, but they will have exported to that company from time to time, and probably will do so in the future.
On the face of it, at least, the uranium industry is maintaining a positive outlook. How damaging will it be to the nuclear industry worldwide?
I think that the factors which were driving the growth in the nuclear power industry last Friday are the same factors which are driving the growth in the nuclear power industry today.